Hi everybody, I'm Zilla Blitz and welcome. Today we're going to take a look at Tally Ho, the solitaire book print and play game published by Thomas Van Hare about the Battle of Britain. Now at the heart of this game is a 15 mission campaign game where you take the role of the British and try to win the Battle of Britain. With more than 100 pages, this book is packed with historical information as well, and there's even a political sphere that overlays the combat results to determine if you actually do win the Battle of Britain. I'm going to do an unbooking of this and then show a little bit of gameplay and then offer some thoughts on my experiences with the game. So let's take a walk through the book here. First up, we've got about 117 pages, I think, in all, counting some of the blank pages at the end of the book. But if we start out, we get kind of some contents dedication, some acknowledgments and things like that. And then we get into the first numbered page here, which is page 1. This gives an introduction to the game. And then as we go through it, we get basically the rules section. This tells you how to execute the game. And the game largely consists of a campaign that simulates the Battle of Britain, consisting of 15 missions, and each of those 15 missions are carved up into 5 different phases of 3 missions each. Now, I've gone through the rules and I've read through the rules and I've played a couple scenarios, and I can say the rules are very clear, very easy to execute, very well explained with lots of details, lots of colors, lots of explanations in terms of how you work your way through the setup, how you work your way through the German movement, the British movement, any dogfights, and then kind of resetting an admin phase before you go into the next round. And that's basically the sequence of play. German planes are going to move. British planes are going to move. If the German planes move and there's some bombing execution, you're going to do that. Then the British planes move and there's rules for them. I mean, you do have control over the British planes, but the German planes just move automatically because they are AI controlled, and you can only play the British in the Battle of Britain. So you can't play both sides here. You're just playing the British as you go through this. Then the British planes move, and then any dogfights that result, you resolve those. And each one of these sections kind of cover those different things. There's rules for when bombs get dropped and rules for when planes must return to base and all these kinds of things. But a very good rule section that takes you all the way through page 16, 17, 18 here. And then we get a nice gameplay. This is about 5 or 6 example of game. This kind of reinforces the learning and helps bring the rules to life. I found this very helpful for kind of clearing up any kind of points of ambiguity or wonderings that I had after I'd read the rule. It's really always nice to see detailed examples of play in here. And this is a full-fledged game system too. This is not an abstract system. These are maps with units and counters and combat that's executed, and there are detailed rules for this whole thing. So this is a game in a book. It's not a book game, I should say, because you're going to have to print out your counters and you're going to want to print out your maps and some of the playing aids as well too. So this isn't a game that you play in the book. This is a game that you print out the pieces you need from the book, and we'll see that as we get through and then execute the game. So there's our example of play, and then a good chunk, this meat of the game, comes into the history and the missions. And that's a point of emphasis I think that is really well done with this game. That's very apparent is how they've embedded not only the history of the Battle of Britain, but a lot of history of the different aircraft that fought in the battle. And we'll show that as we go through here. But this gives a section kind of typical. This is phase 1. So like we mentioned, there are 5 phases, each consisting of 3 missions. And all of the missions up here grounded in actual historic raids that happened during the Battle of Britain. So we can see this is the historical summary for mission 1, 2, and 3, the 3 missions in phase 1. Then we come into mission 1, the Battle of Britain begins, and this is your first scenario. And here is the map that you'll want to print out for the first mission. These are all the rules for the setup and some of the gameplay charts. And then there is some randomness to setup, both in terms of what types of planes appear and how many types of planes appear. So I think this has a lot of replayability. It's not going to be the same thing each time you play it through. And sometimes you might get lucky and get a little bit of an easier setup, and then other times you might get unlucky and you're going to be kind of probably less than average outnumbered in a particular battle as well. So this is the layout and the map for scenario 1. Then we get the same thing for scenario 2, scenario 3, and then we go on to phase 2, and this is a lather, rinse, repeat that goes all the way up through all 15 missions in the game. So that gives you an idea then in terms of what the mission component of it is, and they're all different. They gradually get, some of them are much larger than others. The first one, of course, is a simpler one here. And then we get all the way through the end of the last 15th mission. And then as you're going through, this is your campaign tracking sheet that tells you whether you won or lost, how many Vicks were lost and Schwarms were lost, how many planes were gone, and all these kinds of things, any special notes in a win or a loss. And then you take all of those results and you get to see how it actually played out. This is a cool thing. You do two things. One is you generate your narrative of the game, and then the second thing you do is you look through and you build up what happens in the political sphere based on the military results that you got. So you can win the Battle of Britain and still get a poor political outcome. So again, a big part of this that I think is really well done is this narrative element of the game. So what you do here basically, this is the narrative paragraphs that you can get. So here you go for the first phase. If you won all 3 of the missions, you read this paragraph. If you won 2, you read this paragraph. If you won 1 of the missions in phase 1, you read this. And then if you didn't win any at all, you read this, and then you go to second phase. So you can literally kind of read through the historic account of your particular campaign, depending upon how well you did militarily in the campaign. And this goes on through all 5 of the phases, generating a kind of a very rich and unique narrative, and then it closes out with the final military report here, and it's signed at the end. So that goes there. And then we're not done yet, because then you go to the War Cabinet vote and the results of whether Britain is going to surrender or fight on. And this is a really unique system. Now, of course, there isn't skill involved in this. This is just kind of, okay, you fought the military battles and that's where you had your skill and executed that. And then depending on how well you did skill-wise, you're going to get this kind of political narrative that determines whether Britain continues on in the fight or surrenders. And basically, it's how well you did in the various battles are going to lead to recommendations from the War Cabinet, and recommendations from the War Cabinet then in turn are, and there's die rolls in here too, so you can get unlucky and do poorly even though you did well in the Battle of Britain. Likewise, you could do mediocre in the Battle of Britain but do fairly well based on some die rolls here and get a lot of fight-on recommendations from the cabinets that carry over into the Parliament vote. And then that depends on what types of speeches and influence is going to be given to the Parliament vote. And you go through the next phase of this, which is to roll dice and kind of calculate, depending upon those speeches and influence, how the vote goes for each of these different parties represented in Britain in World War II. And so then you're going to actually get a tally up kind of vote as to how many votes there are for surrendering and how many votes there are for continuing on. And you're going to get a final determination as to whether Britain actually continues to fight on or surrenders. So that's, I think, which is a really cool execution part of this, is that, you get your battle, you fight through the whole thing, then you get the narrative story of the battle that comes out, and then you have this political story that you play out at the end of it to kind of determine whether Britain finally continues on or surrenders. We're not only done. This gets at the historical element after that. We're up to page 90 now. The last pages here are all kind of specifications, technical specifications, and kind of the historical record and notes and comments on all of the different planes that are represented in the game. And here we can see kind of blow-ups of their counters. So this goes on quite a bit. A lot of detailed stories, kind of setting the record straight on Italy's Battle of Britain involvement. So as a historical account, this is really cool and really well done. Radar glossary, chain home, and sector control. So just a lot of historical flavor added onto this. So this is both game and history, and nothing has been left out. Now, here we're looking at the counters. So these are the counters that you print out. I've done that for the game here, and I kind of put them on cardboard and double stock them and kind of double stuck them together and things like that. So you get the set of counters that you need. And these are two-sided. The back side of these are actually not reduced strength. They're when the aircraft runs out of fuel and ammunition, it has to do a return to base. So it's reached its bingo point, or it doesn't have any more ammo. That means it's heading back to base. So you flip it over to designate that on the map, so you know that you have to move these squadrons, either the Germans straight off the map or the British back to their Air Force. And then we have some charts, and this is an Air Force procurement chart example, but we have some charts and gameplay aids that, again, you want to make copies of these. And all of these are available on Board Game Geek to print out, so you don't have to copy them from the book. The maps are there, counters, the mission tracking sheet, and this massed formation tracking sheet are here. So these are player aids you use, and this one's really important, the mission tracking sheet, because you're going to be doing a lot of record keeping as to damage to the squadrons and things like that, and this is going to be how you calculate victory points in the game as well. And then there's lastly here, an air combat is a realistic depiction, and Thomas Van Hare actually has a deep aviation history. He is a pilot, and he has a pretty amazing life. He's worked for the U.S. government as well. Very fascinating life behind this. So he's bringing a lot of his life experiences and experiences with aviation into this game. Game design notes here, player guide and advisory. So this gives you kind of some tips on playing, and then a little bit here about the author. And that takes us through to everything that is inside Tally Ho. Let's take a look at some gameplay. All right, so I've set up mission 1 here, which basically signifies the beginning of the Battle of Britain. And we've got some German squadrons here that are moving from the coast of France. Here is England, and these are their 2 targets, 2 convoys that are off the coast of England here. Now, we've rolled up the formations here, and it's somewhat random. We ended up with 3 squadrons of Dornier bombers, Dornier 17 bombers, and 1 squadron of Bf 109 Emil fighters. And so we could have easily had 3 squadrons of fighters and 1 squadron of bombers. You get a great variety when you roll up these missions to, again, kind of highlight the gameplay replayability. But we got 3 bomber squadrons coming here. Now, these designations right here, SL, this is where it starts out. So these Dorniers are coming in at sea level. These are coming in at high level. These are coming in at high level. And this fighter squadron here is coming in at low level. Now, for the British, we actually got pretty lucky. We rolled 2 squadrons of Spitfires, so there's 1 there, and then 1 here in Hawking. I'm not sure if I got that pronunciation right. So 2 squadrons of Spitfires and a squadron of Hurricanes. So they are here, and their goal is going to be to try to intercept the planes, generally aiming for the bombers to try to knock them out, because if you can dogfight with a bomber and you destroy one of the staffels that are in there, one of the swarms that are inside this squadron, basically, then it automatically jettisons its bombs and it returns to base. So that's one way to protect these targets, is to engage them in dogfighting, force them to have some damage, which then turns the whole squadron back towards France. So we've got everything set up here. Let's take a quick look at the aircraft specifications. So before each mission, you use this mission tracking sheet and you write down the Luftwaffe Staffels that are involved. So we see the 3 Dornier 17s and the Bf 109E, and then we see the 2 Spitfire squadrons and the Hurricane squadron. And then you put their ID marker. And then here we have how many Vics and a Vic and how many Schwarms. And these are basically groups of 4 planes. So a full squadron has 4 Vics and a full Staffel has 4 Schwarms, but you roll a die to determine whether the squadrons and Staffels are at full strength. Now, we rolled full strength for all 7 of the squadrons, except for the squadrons of Hurricanes, which is actually missing one of their Vics, so they're down to 3. So a little bit weaker here for this one. Then also over here, you record their fuel and ammo. Notice about the Bf 109s. The black dots means that they're not available. The white dots that are not filled in and consumed yet are the ones that are available. So the Bf 109E, even though it's a equal fighter to the Spitfire and here in the Hurricanes in the games and things like that, it's only got 2 points of fuel and ammo left, which means it's kind of near its bingo point. So it didn't have the greatest range, and that's how that's signified in the game here. Then we get the attack and defend numbers. Lower numbers for attack are better because you have to hit this number or higher to cause damage on the enemy, and then higher defend numbers are good because you have to roll that number or lower to defend against an attack. And we'll see how these work. So we can see that Dornier 17s aren't very good when they get into dogfights because they need a 6, as opposed to the British fighters that need 5s. And the Spitfires have a special advantage. When they are dogfighting against German fighters, you get an extra attack die too. Then here we have the movement allowance, and then here we have the strafing and bombing characteristics. So if the Dorniers or the Messerschmitts here make it to their targets, they get a different number of die rolls basically when they're doing their bombing run. And then this is the place where we keep track of the dogfight ratings, and this is where we note the altitude of the squadron. So we have 2 at high level, 1 at lower level, the fighters, and then that's that Dornier squadron that's coming in right on top of the waves, and they've got close to us before our radar picked them up. So you do this before each battle. You kind of record this information, and this is where at the end of the turn we're going to be jotting down the damage and make sure that we keep track of how the battle's going. So showing the whole mission here is beyond the scope of this video, but I want to show a segment of each turn so you get a sense for how gameplay works. Now each turn in a mission, and again, missions don't have a turn limit. The mission ends when there's breakaway and both sides disengage and there's no chance for those sides to re-engage or any targets to be bombed and things like that. So the mission length is variable in terms of turns, but first up, each turn starts with the German movement. And what we use here are these Luftwaffe movement charts for the type of plane. So we can see here, I'll show the movement chart for the Dornier 17s. So we're going to roll one die now, and that's going to tell us what this Dornier 17 is going to do. And let's do this first one here at sea level. We get a 4. So 4 says turn to target and basically proceed directly to the target. Now we have 2 targets up here. They are both equidistant away. So there are basically, and this has a movement of 3, we can tell from its mission tracking chart. We could go 1, 2, 3, or we could go 1, 2, 3, or we could go 1, 2, 3, and all of them are kind of working towards that target. So we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to determine which column it ends up in. And we'll just do a random die roll here to decide that. So we get a 2. So this one here is going to go 1, 2, 3 and end up, and I think actually we go 1, 2, 3 and then turns it towards its target here. I think it moves and then turns in like that. So it's moved here, which is good. It's close to our Spitfire. We might be able to engage that one there. However, if we don't engage it, 1, 2, 3, the next turn, it can head right into this target, although there is some anti-aircraft fire that it would run into here. Now, I'm going to do the same thing for the other German aircraft here, the fighters and the other Dornier 17s, and we'll see what we end up when this is done. So after rolling for the bombers, every single one of them got turns to target. This one ended up moving towards this target as well. This one was over here. This one here was to the west, and so it ended up moving here and pointing. So these 3 squadrons of Dorniers are heading right towards this western flotilla here of British ships. The Messerschmitts got turned towards the RAF, so it heads directly towards the nearest squadron. It was here, so that was really a straight ahead move here. So the German movement is done, and that's how German movement works. So we continue this on, and there's rules for if a German squadron enters a space with the British squadron, it immediately stops its movement, and that's when a dogfight ensues. And so we can, there's variable rules for how it goes, but generally that AI pattern there is going to determine how the German moves. Now we come to the next phase, which is British movement. The RAF gets to move. And by the way, there are international squadrons in this too with different characteristics. I know there's some Polish squadrons which have lower communications but really good dogfighting skills. So there's an international flair to this as well. And we did see in the counter mix too, there are Italian squadrons that come into the combat situation as well. So now we're going to move for the British craft. For British movement, you don't get to move exactly as you would like. You have to use this RAF communication chart, which signifies basically information coming to the British pilots that's going to inform them where they can go and where they can head and limit their kind of coordination to attack the German planes. And how this works is, if we look at this communication chart, for example, for the Spitfires, we can see if we roll a 1 to 3, we get no communication, which means basically the aircraft has to go straight ahead. That's a really bad result. 4 means we can move wherever we want, but we can't engage one of the German squadrons, the German Staffels. However, if we get anything a 5 or greater, we can do whatever we want and move and engage as we would like. However, there's die roll modifiers to this that really make it likely that you're going to be able to be pretty free until you suffer a lot of damage, because you get +1 for each Vic that is in your squadron. And we know right now the 2 Spitfires both have 4 Vics, so it's going to be the die roll +4. So they're always going to succeed. However, if you roll a 1 on a 1d6, it's always no communications, signifying a breakdown in communications, and they go straight ahead. Furthermore, we could combine these into one roll if the squadrons are in the same place. We're not going to, because I want to make it less likely that we're going to get a disastrous result, and both of these squadrons are going to have to move straight ahead and disengage by themselves. So we will roll now for the Spitfire. And let's just kind of check this. It has no aces in here. There is a mechanic for aces. We're hoping for anything except a 1. We get a 5. So this one can move and engage. And what we want to do here, we're going to move straight ahead 1, and we get a movement of 3. We're going to move right in here, and we're going to trigger a dogfight. So we'll resolve that later. And now I'm going to go ahead and move these other British squadrons. I think what I'd like to do is to get probably the Spitfires on these Messerschmitts and try to mess them up a little bit, but we might try to pass them and see if we can go right after the bombers, because the bombers are going to create a lot of damage and let the Spitfires come to us. But we'll move that and we're going to kind of see what happens here. So here's what happened after all of our British planes had great communications. We had no breakdowns in communications. So we were able to move, I'm moving the Hawkeyes, the Hurricanes, right here, hoping that the Dorniers are going to come right into them on their way to this target. We have the Spitfires engaging with the Dorniers, and then I move the other squadron of Spitfires to engage with the Messerschmitts, because we do have an advantage against them, so it'd be kind of cool to see what happens there. Okay, so now we've shown British movement, we've shown German movement. Let's take a look at some dogfighting. For the sake of combat, let's show how these Spitfires engaged with these Dorniers, and I'm just going to separate them here. And we'll notice that there's a neat marker here, White Cliffs of Dover. So the Battle of Britain in this campaign starts with a dogfight right near the White Cliffs of Dover. And even though the Spitfires are facing this way, I'm going to spin them around so the counter is going to be a little bit easier to see here. Now, combat's actually executed quite simply. We're going to look at the combat numbers for the aircraft, and their action taken out simultaneously. We can see here the Spitfire has an attack of 5 and a defense of 1. And you roll 1 die for each Vic that's in the squadron. This is a full strength Vic, so we're going to roll 4 dice. Any number that we get that's a 5 or greater is going to be a hit on the Dorniers. Any one that's a 1 is going to be a defensive roll for the Spitfires. So let's see how the Spitfires do. We're hoping for, essentially, 5s or 6s or 1s. We don't want 2, 3s or 4s. We get 4 rolls. We would get more rolls if there was an ace, and some of the international squadrons get better rolls too. We get a 5, a 6, a 1, and a 2. That's a pretty good roll. So we know that we get 2 hits from our Spitfires, and we get 1 defensive roll. That's going to negate a hit from the Dorniers. Okay, but the Dorniers get to fire back, and combat again is executed simultaneously. We can see here the Dorniers have a 6 and a 1. So their attack is not as good. They're bombers, right? They're not good, but their defense is okay. It gets a 1. Well, I mean, 1's not good, I guess. But they're going to, likewise, they have a full strength. They have 4 swarms in their Staffel, so we're going to roll 4 times. We get 4, 4, 1, 1. So we get no hits by the Dorniers, but we get 2 defensive 1s. So we get 0 hits by the Dorniers and 2 defensive negations. So now we can compare our results and apply the damage. The Dorniers got 0 hits, so there's no hits and no Vic losses to the Spitfires. Even though they had 1 defensive roll, it doesn't matter because the Dorniers didn't hit anything. The Spitfires had 2 5s or 6s, so they got 2 hits on the Dorniers. However, the Dorniers rolled 2 1s, so they negate those 2 hits. So at the end of this first round of combat, which happens in this turn, we're going to go to the next movement turn and see what happens. They could get stuck here, or they could continue on and break away and things like that. Unfortunately, we didn't do any damage to the bombers, because if we had in a dogfight, they would have jettisoned their bombs and they would have immediately returned to base. So what we have to do now, there's no damage, no losses here. What we have to do now, however, is after a dogfight, you randomly roll to determine the aircraft's facing after the attack. So we are going to roll a 1 to 6. 1 is up to the north, and then 6 is to the northwest. So I'll roll for the Dornier, and we'll just kind of fix their facing right now. So here's the Dornier's roll. It gets a 1, which means it's continuing on towards its target. That's not good. Spitfires get a 2. So they will be facing to the northeast. So let's rearrange those, heading north and heading northeast, like that. And this combat for this turn is over for those fighters. And that's basically how combat works in the game. Now we could do the next one. We could execute the Spitfires versus the Messerschmitts here, but it's done in the same way. And you kind of basically apply the results in the same way. It's unlikely that there was going to be no damage, but we could have seen a lot of damage. It could have gone either way depending upon the dice rolls. Spitfires have an advantage, but this time it didn't pay off because the Dorniers were particularly elusive. Now the other thing we would do at the end of that turn, because there was a dogfight involving the Spitfire Squadron number 2 with ID 2, we would have to consume one of their fuel and ammo amounts, leaving it with 2, so it could have 2 more attacks. And over here, we would just record 2 hits, 1 defense, and then we would do likewise down here for the Dornier 7. That was Staffel 3. They used up 1 of their fuel and ammo points, and they got 0 hits to defense, and that way we get a record here of how the battle played out as well. The last thing we want to see is how the Germans are able to destroy targets and bomb targets. So let's assume that this Staffel number 3 continued on at sea level, broke away from the mainland so we won't deal with all of the anti-aircraft fire that might result there, and it's attacking this eastern convoy. So if it gets a move that's turned towards target, it's going to proceed toward its target, and this happens during the movement phase. So this Staffel would move into this square, and most targets in different destinations have anti-aircraft fire. Convoys have light anti-aircraft fire, so as soon as this Staffel moves in, it has to face anti-aircraft fire. The British get 1 die roll, and it needs a 6 to hit to be able to be a precursor to possibly anti-aircraft fire. Boom, it does. Now we have to see if it actually hits. So the 6 means actually that the Staffel potentially could have losses here from anti-aircraft fire. Because it depends on the altitude, this one actually was at sea level down by there, so it's easier to hit, which means we roll a die again. On a 4, 5, or 6, it hits and they lose 1 Staffel, 1 Schwarm. 4, nice. So we would go over to the mission chart. So over here on the mission chart, we see ID number 3, the Dorniers. We would X off 1 Schwarm, and that means that it was hit and damaged, and the British would get victory points for this even though it was damaged kind of by the anti-aircraft. So that would amass some victory points here for the British. But now, because it's a bombing run, if the bombers have casualties, suffer casualties and losses during the bombing run, they still continue on towards the target. So now they get to attack the convoy. For bombing, we can see, or strafing, we can see that the Dorniers have a B indicating bombing, and we see they have a 4, which is their to hit number. They need a 4, 5, or 6 to hit, and this is the victory points. They get 3 victory points for each hit they get on the convoy. However, mission 1 has a special rule that Dorniers, the bombers, needs 6s to hit on the convoy. They're harder to hit. So it's a little bit of a break here for the British. So we will roll for the 3 Schwarms that made it through the anti-aircraft fire and see if the Germans get any hits on the convoy. Oh, they are dialed up. 2 hits. That's actually bad because the Germans can get a special victory if they get 3 hits on both convoys. That would be +2 victory points for them, a bonus. But they do get 2 hits on the convoys, which would give them 6 victory points. Now those victory points would eventually get noted on the campaign mission track, but now that these Dorniers have dropped their bombs, that's it for them. They immediately get this return to base, so we flip them over and we head them south. They're heading back towards France. So they would be basically trying to make their way back to the French coast. They have dropped their bombs and had a quite successful run with some marginal losses there. And that's basically the core of the game. We've seen the big mechanics, the German movement, how the British move and their communication element, how dogfights work, and how bombing runs work. And there's things like friendly fire, and there's some special rules and things like that too. So there's a little bit more to it, but this is the bulk of the game. So you can see it's not a very complicated game. It's relatively straightforward to execute. And there are a lot of fun decisions. Like one of the questions I'd be asking is, maybe we should have had the Hurricanes come right in here and try to engage that bomber squadron of Dorniers and group up on 2 against 1. Probably would have had a better chance. We would have driven them off and not had them, because next turn they probably would have continued on towards this target. They would have had to run some anti-aircraft fire, but they probably would have made it, So maybe it was better to gang up on them, and then the Dorniers would come in on the next turn. Things can stay together for dogfights. They can break up. The Germans can have massed formations. So there's a number of mechanics we quite haven't looked at, but this is really the essence of gameplay to Tally Ho. And so now that we've seen kind of gameplay, I want to offer a few impressions on this and thoughts, having experienced a number of missions now, read through the rules, and taken a look at all the elements of the game. In no particular order, I wanted to offer up some random thoughts on impressions on the game after kind of spending some time with it now. First up, there's so much in here. I mean, it's over 100 pages, the amount of history, the aircraft specifications, the history of the individual aircraft. You can see the love that's been put into the design and the development. Nothing's been left out. Amazing attention to detail. Combat system and the mission system has been really thought out. And not only do you get that 15 mission campaign game, that's going to have, I think, a lot of variety, because after playing the first and second mission a couple times now, each time it's been different. You don't know where the starting planes are going to be. You don't know what you're going to get as the British. You don't know what you get as a German. So I think you can play through this campaign numerous times and get different results. And one of the things I didn't mention too is that depending on how you do in one mission, there are going to be minor alterations to a subsequent mission. So if you do really well, you could have an advantage in the next mission. You might get an extra Vic or an extra squadron or something like that. And the Germans might lose a Staffel depending on what happens there, or the Germans could get an extra Staffel. So things can happen in subsequent missions depending on how well you do in the previous mission. So there's kind of a little bit of a dynamic element that's woven into the campaign as well. So really rich campaign with a lot of attention to detail. I really like the gameplay, and I like that it took me a little while to learn the execution. There is a little bit of trickiness with like the record keeping and things like that, but once you kind of get the execution and the missions down, they play really fast. I feel like, you know, the book at the back of the book here says 20 to 45 minutes, and I feel like that's pretty accurate. I mean, some of the bigger ones probably going to take a little bit longer. I'd say they might be more like an hour, but generally speaking, once you get the system down after you've played like 3-4 missions, it gets pretty fast. It gets really quick. So I really like the gameplay. I think there's a lot of strategy to the defensive elements. You're making some interesting decisions. Definitely doesn't feel like it's a game on rails. I think it's going to challenge you intellectually to fight well and to make some good decisions as you're going through it. And it's hard. I mean, I haven't played through the whole thing. I've played through the beginning parts, but I feel like it's going to be challenging to do well. And it's also, you can lose missions and still get a decent end result. Although the other interesting part again is that we looked at is that you have that whole political element, that two-stage political element that runs, well, really 3, because you generate your narrative and then you get the war cabinet results and kind of emphasis on whether they're arguing to go on or to surrender, and then you get the parliamentary vote. So just this kind of arc of history of the Battle of Britain and how your impact on the missions and how you did impacts the course of the war. It's just really fascinating, I think, to see how they've kind of built all that into the game. So yeah, big thumbs up to the gameplay and all the content that's in here, in addition to all the historical stuff that's here with the planes and the history of the battle and the political elements. It's really rich and fascinating. I do have a couple thoughts that I think I guess they're negative, but they're not really negative. They're more positive negatives. Let me explain. I wish this were a boxed game. Right, so you got to print out the counters, and you got to make the counters. You got to print out the maps. You got to print out the player aids. You know, there's that element there that is not that print and play is bad, but it's definitely less accessible than a boxed version where you had the counters and you had the maps, and it came in a box and everything's there. Because there's so much here. It's just loaded with stuff that I felt myself immediately wanting this in a boxed format, like fully published with just all the stuff there. So again, not a criticism. The criticism is because there's so much here, it would make it so much more accessible. You have beautiful counters, because I print them on my color printer and they look okay, but it'd be so much better with rich counters and with big map, not big maps, but you know, color maps that you could kind of use and just pull out as you're going through the various missions. So the second thing that I'm not a fan of is the mission tracking sheet. I do find that, you know, there's a lot of pencil record keeping, and it really ties, I think, to my previous comment. I feel like if you had a boxed version, you could make this of a player aid, kind of a mission track player aid, where you could use markers and counters to move things around to reduce the need to be constantly kind of, you know, marking things off and putting things down. You could have this all done in kind of a big graphic format where you had one for each staffel and squadron and stuff like that, and be able to move counters back and forth. That would, I think, make gameplay easier, faster, more visually parsable and stuff like that. So you have to do this, right? For this type of game, for a print and play game, you need this kind of thing. Not a game stopper, but again, it kind of connects to that feeling, oh, I love a boxed version where this was a full player aid that had count markers on it that you're moving back and forth, and the information were kind of presented a little bit differently for the speeds and the attacks on the aircraft, because you could have all this stuff kind of embedded into a player aid off on the side and kind of speed up that part of the gameplay. I feel like that would be a nice advancement for if this were to get to kind of a boxed version of a game. It might take a little bit of rethinking on how it's presented and stuff like that, but this was the only thing that I found myself wishing were a different format. But the gameplay is so rich, so much fun. And then it's not, I mean, you're tracking the stuff, it's there, but I found that's the place where I was most likely to make a mistake, either forget to write something down, like, did they fight? I forgot to move the ammo. And then you look later and you're like, wait, I think they fought twice, but I've only marked them down once. I kind of forget. So that was where I kind of were making mistakes as executing the missions too. So that was something that I would love to see in hand with the box version be transformed into a player aid that makes it easier to execute that element of the game. But yeah, final word, I am really impressed with this. I'm not a print and play person, but if you are all inclined to print and play, I think this is a strong entry into the field. It's a full-fledged, deep, rich game with a ton of historical context. Now, the only caveat I will say that, I didn't play through the whole campaign yet, so these are impressions based on learning the gameplay and executing a couple missions from beginning to end and seeing how they all flow and learning the rules and tracking things and playing those full-hearted and kind of digging into it. But those are fun, so if the campaign arc goes through at that same level of enjoyment, and looking at the missions, I've kind of thumbed through them and looked at there's a ton of variety, different targets, different types, different sizes, all kinds of things going on, different special rules for each one to kind of tweak things and modify the gameplay a little bit, so it's always changing. There's just a lot of thought put into this to keeping the gameplay rich and keeping it replayable. So I think you could easily go through this campaign 3, 4, 5 times if you wanted to. A lot of depth here. But yeah, big thumbs up. I'm blown away by how good this is. Thomas Van Hare from Historic Wings, available on Amazon. I'll put a link to it down below. Let me know if you have questions. I'd be happy to answer them where I can. Thanks for watching, everybody. Have a great day.